saya akan membentangkan iaitu measuring inequality atau mengukur ketidaksamaan. Okey, dalam kaedah mengukur ketidaksamaan, pertama kita menggunakan kaedah size distribution, iaitu pembahagian saiz lah, yang mana taburan pendapatan atau ukuran peribadi adalah ukuran yang paling sering digunakan oleh ahli ekonomi. Ia hanya berkaitan dengan setiap isi rumah dan jumlah pendapatannya yang mereka terima. Cara penerimaan pendapatan tersebut tidak dipertimbangkan. Yang penting adalah berapa banyak pendapatan masing-masing, tanpa mengira sama ada pendapatan itu diperoleh semata-mata dari pekerjaan atau datang juga dari sumber lain seperti faedah, keuntungan sewa, hadiah atau harta pusaka. Tambahan pula, sumber pendapatan wilayah iaitu bandar atau luar bandar dan pekerjaan seperti pertanian, pembuatan, perdagangan dan perkhidmatan tidak diambil kira bulan. Okey, langkah kaedah kedua adalah Laurent curve, iaitu kaedah lain yang biasa digunakan untuk menganalisis statistik pendapatan peribadi adalah dengan membina apa yang dikenali sebagai curve Laurent ini. Okey, paksi menegak menunjukkan bahagian dari jumlah pendapatan yang diterima oleh setiap peratusan penduduk. Pada setiap titik pada penjuru itu, peratusan pendapatan yang diterima sama dengan peratusan penerima pendapatan. Dengan kata lain, garis per penjuru dalam rajah 5.1 mewakili persamaan sempurna dalam pengagihan pendapatan. Dalam gambar 5.1, kami telah memplot curve Lawrence ini menggunakan data desil yang terdapat dalam jadual 5.1. Dengan kata lain, kita telah membahagikan kedua paksi mendata dan menegak menjadi 10 segmen yang sama dengan setiap kumpulan 10 desil. Semakin besar tahap ketidaksamaan, semakin besar melengkung dan semakin dekat dengan paksi mendata bahawa kelengkungan Lawrence. Dua taburan perwakilan telah ditunjukkan pada gambar 5.2, satu untuk pengagihan yang hampir sama, gambar 5.2A, dan yang lain untuk pembahagian yang lebih tidak sama, gambar 5.2B. Okey, kaedah seterusnya melalui perkali gini dan agregat pengukuran ketidaksamaan, yang mana ukuran ringkas dan sangat ringkas mengenai tahap ketidaksamaan pendapatan relatif di sebuah negara dapat diperolehi dengan mengira nisbah kawasan antara lengkung per penjuru dan Lawrence dibahagi dengan luas setengah kuadrat, di mana kelut terletak dalam rajah 5.3. Ini adalah nisbah kawasan berlorek A dengan jumlah luas segitiga BCD. Perkali gini adalah ukuran ketaksamaan agregat dan boleh berubah dari mana-mana, dari kosong persamaan sempurna hingga 1 iaitu ketidaksamaan sempurna. 4 kemungkinan lengkung Lawrence seperti yang terdapat dalam data antarabangsa dilukis dalam rajah 5.4. Dalam kriteria Lawrence pengagihan pendapatan, setiap kali satu curve Lawrence berada di atas curve Lawrence yang lain, ekonomi yang sesuai dengan curve Lawrence atas lebih setara dengan curve bawah. Oleh itu, ekonomi A secara jelas dapat kita dikatakan lebih setara daripada ekonomi D. Setiap kali dua lengkung Lawrence melintasi seperti lengkung B dan C, kriteria Lawrence menyatakan bahawa kita memerlukan lebih banyak maklumat atau andaian tambahan sebelum kita dapat menentukan mana yang mendasari ekonomi yang lebih setara. Kita juga boleh menggunakan ukuran agregat seperti perkali gini untuk memutuskan perkara tersebut. Ternyata perkali gini adalah antara kelas ukuran yang memenuhi 4 sifat yang sangat diingini. Yang pertama dan akhir sekali iaitu pengagihan fungsional, yang mana ukuran umum pengagihan pendapatan kedua yang digunakan oleh ahli ekonomi. Pengagihan pendapatan sebahagian fungsional atau faktor cuba menjelaskan bahagian dari jumlah pendapatan nasional yang diterima oleh setiap faktor pengeluaran, iaitu tanah, tenaga kerja dan modal. Daripada melihat individu sebagai entiti yang berasingan, teori pengagihan pendapatan fungsional meneliti peratusan yang diterima buruh secara keseluruhan dan membandingkannya dengan peratusan jumlah pendapatan yang diedarkan dalam bentuk sewa, faedah, keuntungan, iaitu pulangan ke tanah dan modal kewangan dan fizikal. Walaupun individu tertentu mungkin menerima pendapatan dari semua sumber ini, itu bukan masalah untuk pendekatan fungsional. Ia cuba menjelaskan pendapatan faktor pengeluaran dengan sumbangan faktor ini terhadap pengeluaran. Kelut penawaran dan permintaan dianggap menentukan harga unit di setiap faktor produktif apabila harga unit ini dikenali sebagai dengan kuantiti yang digunakan berdasarkan andaian penggunaan faktor kos minimum yang efisien, kita mendapat ukuran jumlah pembayaran kepada setiap faktor. Kami menganggap bahawa hanya dua faktor pengeluaran modal yang merupakan faktor tetap, iaitu yang diberikan dan tenaga kerja, yang merupakan satu-satunya faktor pun boleh ubah. Keluk permintaan buruh yang negatif seperti ini ditunjukkan garis DL dan rajah 55 dengan keluk penawaran tenaga kerja tradisional neoklasik iaitu SL. Upah keseimbangan akan sama dengan WE, titik WE, dan tahap keseimbangan pekerjaan akan pekerjaan pada titik garisan LE. Jumlah keluaran nasional yang sama dengan jumlah pendapatan negara akan diwakili oleh kawasan kosong RELE. Pendapatan negara ini diagikan dalam dua bahagian. Kosong WELE akan diberikan kepada pekerja dalam bentuk upah, dan WERE yang tinggal sebagai keuntungan kapitalis, iaitu pengembalian kepada pemilik modal. Oleh itu, dalam ekonomi pasaran kompetitif dengan fungsi pengeluaran berterusan ke skala, iaitu penggandaan dari semua input menggandakan output, harga faktur ditentukan oleh keluk penawaran dan permintaan faktur dengan bahagian faktur selalu bergantung untuk menghabiskan keseluruhan produk nasional.
Now I will present about the measuring absolute poverty. What is absolute poverty? Absolute poverty occurs when the situation of being unable or only barely able to meet the subsistence essentials of food, clothing, and shelter. Headcount index is the proportion of a country's population living below the poverty line. Absolute poverty measure of those whose incomes fall below the absolute poverty line, YP, by the headcount. When the head count is taken as fraction of the total population, it can be defined as head count index, which is H over N. Total poverty gap, TPG, is to measure the total amount of income necessary to raise everyone who is below the poverty line up to that line. In the figure 5.6, it shows that how we could measure the total poverty gap as a shaded area between poverty line and the annual income profile of the populations. Even though in both country A and country B, 50% of the population fall below the same poverty line, but the TPG in country A is greater than in country B. So it will take more an effort to eliminate absolute poverty in country A. TPG can be found by adding up the amount by each poor person's incomes fall below the absolute poverty line as the equation below. While for average poverty gap, APG is found by dividing the TPG by the total population N. There are three types of measurement for us to get the size of the poverty gap in relation to the poverty line. The first measurement is by measure the normalized poverty gap, NPG. The formula of NPG is APG divided by YP. If the measure lies between 0 and 1, a so can be useful when we want a unanimous measure of the gap for easier comparisons. For the second measurement is by calculating the average income shortfalls, AIS. The formula of AIS is TPG divided by H. AIS tells us that the average amount by which the incomes of a poor person fall below the poverty line. This measure can also be divided by the poverty line to yield a fractional measure, which is the normalized income shortfall, NIS. The formula of NIS is AIS divided by YP. FGT index is a class of measure of the level of absolute poverty. The formula of FGT index is shown as below. If alpha equals to 0, the numerator is equal to h, and we get the headcount ratio h over n. If the alpha is equals to 1, and we can get the normalized probability gap. While if alpha equals to 2, the impact of measure probability of a gain in income by a poor person's increase in proportions to the distance of the persons from the poverty line. And the resulting measure can be written as like I shows at the bottom of the slide here.
So we move to poverty, inequality, and social welfare. What's so bad about extreme inequality? We are assuming that social welfare depends positively on the level of income per capita, but negatively on poverty and negatively on the level of inequality. The problem of absolute poverty is obvious. No civilized people can feel satisfied with a state of affairs in which their fellow human exists in conditions of such absolute human misery, which is probably why every major religion has emphasized the importance of working to alleviate poverty and is at least one of the reasons why international development assistance has the nearly universal support of every democratic nation. But it may reasonably be asked, if our top priority is the alleviation of absolute poverty, why should relatively inequality be a concern? Based on this question, there are three major answers for this question. For all these reasons, for this part for the analysis, we will write welfare W as equal to W, which is YIP, and Y income per capita, enter of our welfare function positively, I is inequality and enter negatively, and P is absolute poverty and also enters negatively. These three components has distinct significance, and we need to consider all three elements to achieve an overall assessment of welfare in developing countries. Next subtopic is dualistic development and shifting Lorentz curve. Some analyst methodologies. Gary will use Lorentz curve to analyze three limiting cases of dualistic development. First, the modern sector enlargement growth typology, in which the two-sector economy develops by enlarging the size of its modern sector while maintaining constant wages in both sectors. The modern sector enrichment growth typology, in which the economic growth but such growth is limited to a fixed number of people in the modern sector, with both the number of the workers and their wages held constant in the traditional sector. Use traditional sector enrichment growth typology, in which all the benefits of growth are divided among traditional sector workers, with the little or no growth occurring in the modern sector. In the traditional sector enrichment typology, growth results in higher income, a more equal relative distribution of income, and less poverty. Traditional sector enrichment growth causes the Lorentz curve to shift uniformly upward and close toward of the line of equality. In the modern sector enrichment growth typology, growth results in the higher income, a less equal relative distribution of income, and no change in poverty. Modern sector enrichment growth causes the Lorentz curve to shift downward and further from the line of equality. In the case of Levy's type modern sector enlargement growth, absolute income rise and absolute poverty is reduced, but the Lorentz curve will always cross, indicating that we cannot make any unambiguous statement about changes in relative inequality. It may improve or the explanation for the crossing: the poor who remain in the traditional sector have their income unchanged, but these incomes are now a smaller fraction of the larger total, so the new Lorentz curve lies below the old Lorentz curve. At the lower end of the income distribution scale, each modern sector workers receive the same absolute income as before, but now the share received by the richest income group is smaller, so the new Lorentz curve lies above the old one and at the higher end of the income distribution scale. Therefore, somewhere in the middle of distribution, the old and the new Lorentz curve must cross. These three typologies offer different predictions about what will happen to inequality in the course of economic growth. With the modern sector enrichment, inequality would rise steadily, while under traditional sector enrichment, inequality would fall steadily. Under modern sector enlargement, inequality would first rise and then fall. If this admit highly stylized process of development were occurring, we would not be concerned about the temporary rise in inequality because in addition to being temporary, it would be reflecting a process in which citizens are, one by one, achieving incomes above the absolute line. This observation tells us that we have to qualify our conclusion that a rise in inequality is inherent badly. In some cases, inequality may increase on a temporary basis due to causes that will eventually make everyone better off and ultimately lower inequality.
Next, my part is Kuznets inverted U hypothesis. Simon Kuznets said, early stage of economic growth, the distribution of income will tend to worsen. Only a later stage it will improve. Next, I want to explain about Kuznets curve. In a graph reflecting the relationship between a country's income per capita and its equality of income distribution. In economics, a Kuznets curve graph the hypothesis that as an economy develops, market force first increase, then decrease economic inequality. The hypothesis was first advanced by economist Simon Kuznets in the 1950 and 1960. The effect of GDP on inequality inverse U-shape. Next, I want to explain why inequality might worsen during the early stage of economic growth before eventually improving. The Kuznets curve can be generated by a steady process of modern sector enlargement, growth as a country develops from a traditional to a modern sector. First, education may rise as the emerging modern sector demands skills and then may fall as the supply of educated workers increase and the supply of unskilled workers falls. Next, I will explain about evidence on the inverted U hypothesis. We can see the table 5.3. That is data collected from 80 countries on the percentage share in total national income going to different percentile groups. For example, we can see that in Zambia, the poorest 20% first quintile of the population receive only 3.6% of the income, while the highest 10% and 20% fifth quintile receive 38.9% and 55.2% respectively. By contrast, in a relatively equal developed country like Japan, the poorest 20% receive a much higher 10.6% of the income, while the richest 10% and 20% get only 21.57% and 35.7% respectively. Next, my part is growth and inequality. The relationship between economic growth and inequality. During the 1960s and 1990s, per capita growth in East Asia averaged 5.6%, while that of Africa declined by 0.2%. Yet both Gini coefficients remain essentially unchanged. It is not just the rate but also the character of economic growth that determine the degree to which the growth is or is not reflect and improving living standards for the poor. Clearly, it is not necessary for inequality to increase for higher growth to be sustained.
Okey, slide saya ini saya akan menerangkan tentang growth and poverty. Okey, apa itu growth and poverty? Okey, growth and poverty ni dia menerangkan bahawa satu badan pendapat memegang bahawa pertumbuhan pesat tidak baik untuk golongan miskin kerana mereka akan rasa dipinggirkan oleh perubahan struktur pertumbuhan ekonomi. Yang kedua, kebimbangan bahawa usaha tertumpu kepada kemiskinan yang lebih rendah akan memperlahankan kadar pertumbuhan ekonomi. Next slide adalah menunjukkan 5 sebab mengapa dasar-dasar yang memberi tumpuan kepada tahap kemiskinan sememangnya dapat membantu mempercepatkan pertumbuhan ekonomi. Yang pertama, ia mengatakan bahawa kemiskinan yang meluas mewujudkan keadaan di mana golongan miskin mempunyai akses yang terhad kepada kredit, iaitu tidak dapat membiayai pendidikan anak-anak. Okey, yang kedua, kita boleh lihat banyak data empirikal menanggung saksi kepada fakta bahawa tidak seperti pengalaman sejarah negara maju sekarang yang kaya sekarang adalah banyak negara-negara yang miskin. Hal ini dapat dilihat keinginan mereka untuk menyelamatkan adalah dengan cara melaburkan sebahagian besar pendapatan mereka kepada ekonomi tempatan. Yang ketiga, kita boleh lihat pendapatan rendah dan tahap kehidupan yang rendah untuk golongan miskin yang ditunjukkan di dalam kesihatan, pemakaian dan pendidikan yang lemah. Yang keempat, kita boleh lihat dengan peningkatan tahap pendapatan golongan miskin akan merangsang peningkatan keseluruhan permintaan terhadap produk keluaran tempatan. Okey, sebagai contohnya makanan dan pakaian. Golongan kaya ni pula mereka ni cenderung membelanjakan lebih banyak pendapatan tambahan mereka ke atas barangan-barangan mewah seperti barangan import. Yang terakhir, pengurangan kemiskinan besar-besaran dapat merangsang pengembangan ekonomi yang sihat dengan bertindak sebagai bahan yang kuat dan insentif psikologi kepada penyertaan awam yang meluas dalam proses pembangunan. Okey, itu saja daripada saya. Terima kasih.
Today I'm going to brief on absolute poverty, which is extent and magnitude. The critical problem of eradicating absolute poverty is one of bad news and good news. It is extremely difficult to arrive at a tight estimate of the extent of global poverty at any point in time. For instance, the $1 a day line was first set in 1987, and for years the standard was $1.08 in 1993 US purchasing power parity. In 2008, the equivalent line was reset at $1.05 at 2005 US purchasing power. Major World Bank report issued within a couple of years of each other have provided estimate of the dollar-a-day headcount that differ by tens of millions of people. Another difficulty in determining the most appropriate cut-off income for extreme poverty. In 2010 World Development Indicators, the World Bank estimated that the number of people living in extreme $1.25 a day poverty was approximately 1.4 billion in 2005. This gave a head count ratio of just over 18%, reflecting the steady progress against poverty of recent years. In 1987, over 28% of the world's people lived below the same poverty line. Figure 5.14 shows the World Bank's current estimate of the trends of poverty reduction that has been reported. There has been very substantial progress in reducing the still enormous numbers of people living in extreme poverty at $1.25 per day. The number living on less than $2 per day has remained relatively stable. Let us move to Table 5.5, which provides some survey-based poverty estimates by region at the $1.25 and $2 poverty lines. As can be seen, poverty incidence is very high in both South Asia, with about 40% below $1.25 per day, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, with 51% below. But poverty severity is far higher in Sub-Saharan Africa, with a squared poverty gap index P2 at 11.05, far above that of South Asia at 3.64. Research suggests that approximately one-third of all people who are poor at any one time are always poor. Therefore, Andrew McKay and Bob Balch provided a well-regarded guesstimate that about 300 to 420 million people were chronically poor at the $1 per day level in the late 1990s. Chronic poverty is concentrated in India, where the largest number are found, and in Africa, where the severity of poverty among the chronically poor is greatest. An income-based definition of ultra-poverty is living on half the $1 a day poverty line, or 54 cents per day in 1993. According to IFPRI estimates, 162 million people live below this stark income level, generally with malnutrition and other destitute conditions. So that's all from me. Thank you.
In conclusion, income inequality can be defined as the disproportionate distributions of total national income among households, and it can measure using two approaches, which is size distributions of income and functional distributions. Absolute poverty is the number of people living below poverty line, which do not have enough basic needs, while extreme poverty is people not having enough income to meet the most basic human needs. Relative poverty can be defined as poor by comparison to others in societies. Those who never get out of absolute poverty, or they cannot afford to have food and basic needs for a long period, was called chronic poverty. The relationship in growth and inequality is a progress on extreme poverty, clear progress on $1.25 a day head count, and incidence of extreme poverty is uneven in the developing world. The low income and low level of living for the poor shows in poor health, nutrition, and education that can lower their economic productivity. Thank you. That's all from our group.